Welcome, everyone, to a deep dive into something we all know and love, video game graphics.
Yeah.
We're going to trace the evolution from, from those, like, blinking lights all the way to the incredible visuals we see today.
Yeah, it's a long and fascinating road, that's for sure.
And get this, our sources aren't just, the usual suspects. We've got this YouTube video transcript that's backed with info, some old podcast directories, even a couple of articles thrown in there.
Yeah.
We're going to unpack it all, see like what innovations really mattered, both, technically and artistically.
Totally.
And trust me, there are some surprises along the way. Did you know, for instance, that the first coin-operated arcade game might actually predate Atari?
I did not know that, actually. That's cool.
Yeah. Or how about this? That Pac-Man was actually designed to appeal to women.
Oh, wow. I've heard that.
It's true.
Yeah.
So let's rewind the clock. Way back, 1950. I was reading about this thing called Birdie the Brain.
Birdie the Brain.
It was like a giant tic-tac-toe machine.
Wow.
At the Canadian National Exhibition.
Really?
Yeah.
I've never heard of that one.
Now, could this be like the first instance of a game being played on a screen?
It very well could be.
Yeah.
I mean, think about it. People lining up to play tic-tac-toe against this massive computer.
Right.
It's a fair cry from, the games we have today.
Sure.
But Birdie's display, I mean, that was revolutionary for its time. It brought the game to life visually. And that's a key step toward what we know as video games today.
Yeah. It's crazy how such a simple concept can have such a huge impact.
Yeah.
And then just 8 years later, we've got Tennis for Two, literally just 2 lines and a dot on an oscilloscope.
Wow.
But the Genie, what's really interesting is it was purely for entertainment. This is 1958. Back then, games were usually built to show off tech, not for fun.
Right.
That's what makes it so significant, right?
It really does.
Yeah.
It shows that, even in those early days, people, they recognized the potential of games to be more than just demonstrations. They could be engaging, exciting experiences in their own right. And that visual element was a key part of that.
Totally. So, okay, we've got these early pioneers.
Yeah.
Figuring out that games can be visually engaging. Then, as arcades start popping up, things get really interesting.
Yeah.
There's this battle between 2 approaches to graphics, raster and vector. Now, I know raster is basically pixels, but remind me, what was vector all about?
So think of vector graphics, like those cool geometric line drawings, like you might see in a retro sci-fi movie or something like that.
Okay.
They're all sharp lines and curves calculated mathematically. So games like Asteroids and Tempest, they use that style. And they still look really clean, even today.
Right.
Yeah.
So, you mentioned raster, or pixels won out in the end. Why was that? Was it just that pixels were easier to work with?
It was more about the creative possibilities.
Oh.
So, vector was great for smooth lines, but it couldn't handle the complexity of scenes or the variety of colors that pixels allowed.
Right.
So think about, Pac-Man and Donkey Kong. I mean, those worlds are packed with details and characters that wouldn't have been possible with vector graphics. So Pixels gave developers that freedom to create more visually rich and diverse games.
I got it. So more freedom to create detailed worlds.
Exactly.
So we've got pixels on the rise, but it's still pretty basic, right? Black and white, simple shapes.
Yeah.
When did color really enter the picture?
The game that really made color take off was Galaxian in 1979.
Wow.
Before that, it was mostly monochrome,
Right.
So you can imagine playing Pac-Man with gray ghosts chasing a gray Pac-Man. I mean, it just wouldn't be the same.
No kidding. But, it's not just about looking pretty, right? Did color actually, change the way games were designed?
Oh, absolutely.
All right.
I mean, it meant enemies could be differentiated at a glance, power-ups could be easily spotted, and feedback from the game became more visually engaging.
Right.
So you think about those flashing lights when you get an extra life.
Yeah.
I mean, it's color that makes those moments exciting.
I never thought about it that way. So color wasn't just a visual upgrade.
Right.
It actually added a whole new dimension to gameplay.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've got color, we've got pixels. What's the next big hurdle?
The next challenge was creating the illusion of depth and exploration.
Right.
And that's where scrolling comes in.
Okay.
Now, it seems like a simple concept, moving the background, but back then it was a technical feat.
Yeah, I can imagine those early arcade cabinets weren't exactly like powerhouses, Why was scrolling so difficult?
You got to remember, these systems had limited processing power and memory.
Right.
To scroll, they had to constantly update the display, moving background elements and characters while still keeping track of everything else happening in the game. It was a lot to handle.
So how did they pull it off? Was it like baby steps, just a little bit of scrolling at first?
Yeah, you could say that.
Okay.
So Speed Race from the 1974.
Okay.
That was kind of a pioneer. It had a simple vertically scrolling track.
Yeah.
So think of it like, those old racing games where the road's rushing towards Yala. Basic, but it was the start of something huge.
Wow. So we're seeing scrolling open up game worlds in a way that was like never possible before. It's like going from a single stage to like a whole world to explore.
Right.
But it wasn't just about moving the background. There's more to creating depth, right?
Exactly. Developers were like itching to make things feel more three-dimensional, even while working in 2D.
Right.
So one technique they used was sprite scaling.
Sprite scaling.
Yeah, so games like Radar Scope and Turbo.
Okay.
They tried this resizing sprites to make them seem like they were moving closer or further away.
Oh, I've seen that.
Yeah.
It wasn't always perfect, but it's pretty clever for the time.
Yeah.
It's like they were hacking the limitations of the hardware to create a 3D effect.
Exactly. And those early experiments, they paved the way for, the amazing 2D graphics we saw in the mid-'80s and early '90s.
Right.
This was like the golden age of sprites. Those 2D images that represented characters and, everything else in the game world.
Sprites. The heart and soul of so many classics. I mean, I grew up with games like Super Mario World and Street Fighter 2.
Oh, yeah.
And those games still look fantastic today.
They do.
And it's all thanks to those, cleverly crafted sprites.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, think about the constraints those artists were working under. Limited colors, small sprite sizes.
Yeah.
And they still managed to create characters with, personality and life.
Right.
It's remarkable how much expression they can pack into just a few pixels.
It really is. But you mentioned hardware limitations. Did those restrictions ease up as technology advanced?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
The 16-bit era with consoles like, the Super Nintendo and Sega Genesis, I mean, that was a game changer.
Right.
Suddenly, sprites could be larger, more detailed, with smoother animation. Games like Strider and Street Fighter 2 really pushed the boundaries of what was possible.
Oh, I can practically hear those arcade cabinets calling my name.
Yeah.
Big, colorful sprites duking it out on the screen. It was a visual feast.
It was. And, it's not like 2D just stopped evolving once 3D came along.
Really?
Developers kept finding new ways to make 2D graphics shine, even as technology progressed.
Like what? Give me some examples.
Well, one technique that became incredibly popular was parallax scrolling.
Parallax.
Yeah. It was used in tons of classic platformers. You remember Sonic the Hedgehog, right?
Of course.
Think of those, like, lush, layered backgrounds whizzing by as Sonic speeds along.
Uh-huh.
That's parallax scrolling at work.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
So instead of just one flat background, they used multiple layers, moving at different speeds.
Exactly.
It's like a visual trick to create the feeling of depth and scale.
Exactly. And it wasn't just limited to platformers. Shadow of the Beast, a side-scrolling action game.
Okay.
It used parallax scrolling to create this incredibly atmospheric and eerie world.
Oh, wow.
It really added to the game's mood and sense of place.
That's fascinating. So we've got sprites, parallax scrolling. I mean, developers were really getting creative with 2D.
Yeah.
But were there any techniques that were, well, a little more experimental?
There were. As the shift toward 3D started, some developers pushed 2D graphics to, like, their absolute limit. One technique was rotoscoping.
Rotoscoping.
Yeah, they'd actually trace over live-action footage to create realistic animation.
Wow. I remember seeing, like, behind-the-scenes videos of that.
Mm-hmm.
It seemed incredibly painstaking. What games used this technique?
Well, Another World and Flashback are two great examples. The character movements in those games were so fluid, almost lifelike. You can really see the influence of traditional animation in those games.
I can see how that technique would make games feel more cinematic.
Yeah?
But wasn't it incredibly time-consuming?
It was, but the results speak for themselves.
Yeah.
Those games achieved a level of visual polish that was rare at the time. And then you had games that used digitized sprites.
Digitized sprites?
Yeah, essentially taking photographs or video footage and converting them into sprites. Mortal Kombat is probably the most famous example of
Well,
this.
yeah, Mortal Kombat. Those, like, realistic digitized characters were a huge part of what made that game stand out. And of course, it sparked a whole conversation about violence in video games.
It did?
Oh, yeah.
But regardless of the controversy, I mean, Mortal Kombat pushed the boundaries of what was visually possible on home consoles.
Totally.
And speaking of pushing boundaries, remember Donkey Kong Country on the Super Nintendo?
Yeah.
Those pre-rendered 3D graphics were mind-blowing for the time.
Donkey Kong Country was gorgeous.
Yeah.
Those environments looked almost like they were from, like, a CGI movie. It felt like a glimpse into the future of, like, gaming graphics.
It was a clever workaround.
Okay.
So developers created 3D models and then rendered them as 2D images.
Oh.
This allowed them to achieve like a level of detail and realism that wouldn't have been possible with traditional sprite-based graphics.
So they were basically sneaking 3D elements into a 2D game.
Yes,
That's brilliant.
it was very clever.
All this talk of 2D is making me nostalgic.
I know.
But I know we have to move on to the rise of true 3D. That's where things really took off, right?
It is. The transition to 3D was a massive leap forward. It wasn't always pretty at first,
Right.
but it opened up a whole new world of possibilities for game developers.
Okay, so 3D is like starting to take over, but I remember those early 3D games being, well, kind of rough around the edges, you know, blocky characters, jaggy environments. It was a far cry from the realism developers were aiming for. What were those early days of 3D like?
It was a wild time. You have to remember, developers were essentially like inventing the tools and techniques for real-time 3D graphics
Right.
as they went along.
Right.
It was a constant learning process, and the hardware was barely keeping up.
So where did it all begin? Where do we even start with 3D graphics?
Well, before we got to the fully textured worlds we know today, there was wireframe.
Wireframe.
Yeah. Imagine looking at a 3D model made only of lines,
Okay.
like a blueprint.
Okay.
That's wireframe.
I got it.
So games like Battlezone, that classic arcade tank game,
Oh, yeah.
they used this technique. And even with those simple visuals, it was incredibly immersive.
I can imagine. You're in this virtual tank looking out at a wireframe battlefield. It must have felt so futuristic back then.
Oh, absolutely. And it wasn't just arcades pushing this technology. Elite, a space trading game on 8-bit home computers, used wireframe to create a massive 3D galaxy.
Wow.
It's incredible what they achieved with such limited hardware.
It really shows how much developers were willing to, like, push the boundaries.
Yeah.
So we've got these, like, skeletal wireframes.
Mm-hmm.
But at some point, things start to get more solid.
Right.
How did we go from lines to actual surfaces?
That's where flat shaded polygons come in.
Flashes, polygons.
Essentially, those wireframe models got filled in with solid colors.
Okay.
It was a simple change, but it made a huge difference visually. Games like Robot, an ambitious arcade game from 1983, used this technique. Sadly, it was ahead of its time and didn't do so well.
That's too bad. But flat shading did find a home in other genres, right?
You're right. Flight simulators, in particular, really benefited from flat shading. Games like FA-18 Interceptor,
Okay.
they prioritize smooth frame rates and large, detailed environments over fancy textures. Visual realism wasn't as important as, the feeling of actually flexing the plane.
That makes sense. So things are progressing. We're going from wireframes to flat shaded polygons. But how do we finally get to those texture mapped 3D worlds that really blow us away?
It was a combination of things.
Okay.
Hardware was getting more powerful, but developers also came up with some clever workarounds.
Okay.
For example, Mode 7 on the Super Nintendo was this neat trick that let you scale and rotate background layers to create a pseudo 3D effect.
Oh, like in Super Mario Kart and F-Zero.
Exactly.
I love those Mode 7 effects. It made those games feel so dynamic, even though they weren't true 3D.
Exactly. It was a great example of pushing 2D hardware to its limits. And then there was raycasting,
Raycast.
a technique used in games like Wolfenstein 3D and groundbreaking Doom. It wasn't true 3D,
Right.
but it allowed for fast rendering of texture-mapped walls,
Oh.
which created a phenomenal sense of depth and atmosphere.
Ugh, Doom. That game was a revelation. It really felt like you were exploring a 3D world, even though it was technically a clever 2D trick. So how do we bridge the gap from these techniques to true 3D?
Well, you had early PC 3D games experimenting with, limited color palettes and simple textures.
Right.
But the real breakthrough came with dedicated 3D accelerator cards.
Okay.
The first of these, the 3DFX Voodoo, was a revolution for PC gaming.
So Voodoo.
Yeah. Suddenly we had higher resolutions, faster frame rates, more complex geometry, and detailed textures. Games like Unreal in 1998 really showcased what was possible with this new technology.
Unreal was incredible.
Yeah.
Those environments were huge and detailed, and the lighting effects were mind-blowing for the time.
And it wasn't just about the visuals. Games like Quake introduced true 3D environments with polygonal enemies and complex levels. This pushed developers to think differently about level design and gameplay, creating new possibilities for interaction and immersion.
It seems like the floodgates were opening. From there, it was just a matter of pushing things further and further, right?
Pretty much.
Yeah.
The late 90s and early 2000s saw a rapid advancement in 3D graphics. Fueled by increasingly powerful consoles like the PlayStation and the Nintendo 64, we got iconic games like Super Mario 64 and The Legend of Zelda, Ocarina of Time, that redefined what was possible in a 3D world.
It's crazy how quickly things progressed, but it wasn't always smooth sailing, was it? Weren't there some missteps along the way?
There were. As developers strived for realism, we entered the era of brown and bloom.
Brown and bloom.
Yeah. Remember when every game seemed to have a muted, desaturated color palette and excessive bloom effects?
Oh, I remember that. I didn't mind it at first, but it did get a bit old after a while. What brought that trend about?
It's interesting, some argue it started with Quake, which used a limited color palette to create a gritty, oppressive atmosphere. But what worked for Quake didn't necessarily translate well to every other genre. And bloom, which was meant to simulate how bright light scatters, was often overused to the point where it became distracting.
Yeah. I remember playing games where the bloom was so intense, it was like looking directly into the sun.
Exactly.
Thankfully, that phase seems to have passed.
Yeah.
But even while developers were chasing realism, there was a counter movement, right? What about cell shading and those more stylized approaches to 3D?
Absolutely. Cell shading, which gives 3D graphics a cartoon-like look, became popular in the early 2000s. Games like Jet Set Radio and The Legend of Zelda, The Wind Waker embraced this style, and they still look fantastic today. They prove that you don't need photorealism to create visually stunning and memorable experiences.
Wind Waker is a great example. I remember some people were skeptical of the art style at first, but it's aged incredibly well. It's vibrant, expressive, and completely unique.
And it highlights an important point. Graphics are more than just a technical showcase. They're about creating a specific aesthetic, a mood, a feeling. And sometimes a stylized approach can be even more effective than chasing photorealism.
So true. And speaking of different approaches, what about the rise of indie games? They often embraced unique, sometimes retro-inspired graphics. Did that have an impact on the evolution of 3D visuals?
Absolutely. Indie games often work with limited resources, which forces them to be creative. So games like VVVVV with its Commodore 64-style graphics and Limbo with its striking black and white aesthetic prove that simple visuals can be incredibly powerful when paired with strong art direction and innovative gameplay.
And we can't forget about Minecraft.
Oh yeah, Minecraft.
That game took the world by storm with its intentionally blocky, pixelated graphics. It's a testament to the idea that compelling gameplay and creative freedom can trump pure visual fidelity.
Minecraft is a phenomenon. It shows that there's no single right way to approach graphics in games. It's all about finding the style that best serves the experience you're trying to create.
So as we look at the current landscape of video game graphics, we see this fascinating mix of photorealism, stylized visuals, and everything in between. Where do you think things are headed? What does the future hold for video game graphics?
It's an exciting time. We have AAA games pushing the limits of realism with, incredible detail and visual effects. And on the other end of the spectrum, we have indie games exploring unique aesthetics and retro-inspired visuals. New technologies like VR and AR are also opening up entirely new possibilities for how we experience and interact with game worlds.
It's incredible to think how far we've come from those early days of blinking lights and simple shapes.
I know.
And it makes you wonder, what will games look like 10, 20 years from now?
Yeah.
Will we reach a point where photorealism becomes indistinguishable from reality? Or will we see a resurgence of stylized graphics, pushing the boundaries of artistic expression in digital worlds?
That's a great question. And it's something to think about. What's clear is that graphics will always be a fundamental part of the gaming experience, shaping how we perceive and interact with these virtual worlds. Whether it's the pursuit of breathtaking realism or the innovative use of stylized visuals, the goal remains the same: to create unforgettable and engaging experiences for players.
Well said. So as we wrap up our deep dive into the history of video game graphics, we're left with a sense of wonder and anticipation. What new visual frontiers will developers conquer next? What breathtaking worlds will they bring to life on our screens? The journey continues, and we can't wait to see what the future holds.